Well, hello. Welcome to this special podcast on Marine Corps tanks, why the Marine Corps has announced that it is deleting all of its main battle tanks. The announcement comes in 2020. We're going to talk about what this means in the future. So we've got three special guests to talk about this. So we'll start with Rob Cogan. Rob, please introduce yourself.
Sure. As stated, I'm Rob Cogan. I'm the curator of the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning, Georgia. Primarily, we're responsible for the armor branch history for the Army, but we also do deal with Marine armor due to the fact that Marine tankers train underneath the U.S. Armor School. I've been in the job now for just over 2 years, and prior to that, I was an armor officer in the U.S. Army on Abrams, Bradley, and Strykers for about 10 years to come to the job. So today I'll be speaking more on the historical aspect of Marine armor.
Thank you, Rob. Now we also have two Marines. I'm going to start with Bill. Could you introduce yourself, sir?
Hi, I'm Bill Marcelino. I am a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. And in that identity, I mostly build scalable analytic techniques and machines for like social media analysis, unstructured data, that kind of stuff. But I had a previous life as a U.S. Marine. And there I was an enlisted infantryman, but later on a tank officer. What I always say is that I realized that the best or the worst ride beats the best walk. So I'm even an officer became a tanker. And I got to do training at Fort Knox back when the armor schools were at Fort Knox. So I did armor officer basic course with the Army, also Scout Leaders course with the Army, which are two great schools. And then I was in 2nd Tank Battalion in the Marine Corps, and then later on in the reserves in 4th Tank Battalion.
Fantastic. What a great collection of experiences. And thank you for your service, sir. Thank you, Bill. So our third guest is JD.
Thanks. I'm JD Williams. I'm also a senior researcher at RAND. I've worked a lot on Marine Corps issues for the past 3 years, their future force design and evolution of amphibious operations. I'm also a retired Marine, colonel. Spent 26 years on active duty. My specialty was intelligence. Spent a lot of time on the West Coast and in the Western Pacific with the 1st Marine Division, a storied history to include Corporation of Armor. And I also was with the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit for 2 deployments and had some interesting experiences relative to armor and use of that in those types of operations. I also spent, after I retired, 12 years in the U.S. intelligence community. My last job was the National Intelligence Officer for Military Issues on the National Intelligence Council. So really glad to be here and talk about this issue with you guys.
Okay, well, what a stellar group. I am humbled to host you on this discussion, so thank you very much. I'll just say that I was on M1 tanks too in the National Guard. I am speaking to you from San Diego, where I lecture at the University of San Diego on intelligence, for instance, homeland security. So let's get into this. So I'm less interested in hearing myself, more interested in hearing what you have to say about this. So the first question we have to answer is why? Why is the Marine Corps getting rid of tanks? What is this policy? What is its justification? Who would like to start with that?
I'd be happy to. I think there's 2 primary and interconnected reasons. The first one's very straightforward. I think it's a matter of economics. The Marine Corps is looking to the future, has a lot of needs and wants, and they're expensive, and defense budgets, even before the COVID crisis, were not going to increase a lot. So they've got to find some savings somewhere. And 4 tank battalions is a fairly hefty amount of inventory and force structure. I think it's important to remember it's not just the tanks themselves, but what goes with that is force structure, an entire career field for enlisted and officers, as Bill said. Plus you've got infrastructure, repair, and important to remember for the Marine Corps, it's not just what's in the inventory. The Marine Corps also has a fairly heavy investment in pre-positioned stocks. So there are tanks in caves in Norway and on two squadrons of maritime pre-positioning ships. So there's a lot to it, and I think looking into the future, the Marine Corps also have to consider modernization of that entire inventory, which would not be cheap. So I think economics is a big driver of this because they're looking to invest in other things. But then it also intertwined with that is what's the view of the role of tanks for the Marine Corps looking ahead to 2030. And here, if you look at the force design and the planning guidance that General Berger, the 38th Commandant, put out when he came in last summer, clearly he is looking, and it's not just him, but he's obviously the driver, are looking at reconfiguring conceptually how the Marine Corps, what the Marine Corps is going to be built to do, and how they think future employment of the Marine Corps is going to be applied. And as they look to the future, they want to reorient. They do not see major pitched land battles at the division level as part of their likely future. They think that in order to contribute to a joint and a naval campaign, particularly against the pacing threat of China, that smaller distributed operations by forces that can deliver effects, not so much against ground or land targets, but against naval and air targets, really needs to be the kind of the core of the future design of the Marine Corps. So while they're not discarding the possibility of engaging in land combat, they just don't think that's a likely pathway. And so the choices that are going to have to be made in terms of the organizational structure and the equipment goes with it are orienting away from the kinds of things that help you in sustained land combat, like tanks and like tubed artillery. And so one of the other things on the divestment list is not all of, but a higher percentage of tube artillery in order to replace that with long-range missiles and rockets that provide effects at greater ranges, and more importantly, provide effects against maritime targets.
So I wanted to add in something on that and to sort of contextualize that in the larger picture. And that is what JD is talking about is part of a larger shift in warfare where long-range precision fires now have superiority. So the current American paradigm for war fighting and for acquisitions for war fighting is really expensive, exquisite platforms. We build these amazingly expensive, incredibly capable platforms like Ford class carriers, M1A2 tanks. We have things like the F-35. These things are incredible, but we have very few of them, and they're immensely expensive. And the sort of the bullet math for warfare has changed right now, and that is that long-range precision fires from either peer or near-peer adversaries. So think of things like anti-ship cruise missiles, precision ballistic missiles. They can now reach out and touch those forces at a longer standoff distance than our forces are prepared to project power. What we found in wargaming, the Marine Corps found in wargaming, is that basically whoever fires first is going to win. That does not square well with our current force design, nor does it square with this idea of amphibious forced entry, right? So the Marine Corps' paradigm since World War II has been something like, we are on an amphibious task force with a lot of forward power projection. We roll up and we invade onto the beach, and then we become a second land army that can project force and protect itself. And the idea is that can happen now. If we roll up to that first and second island chain in the Indo-PACOM region, we will be touched before we can touch them. And in particular, the math works out poorly for us as the force projector. And that is, we have these exclusive platforms that cost millions and billions of dollars, but our peer adversaries can likely destroy them with long-range fires that cost them tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a bad trade-off and one we can't win.
Yeah, well, thank you, both of you. It's very lucidly put, and obviously there's nothing illogical or even unempirically grounded in anything you're saying. So one thing I want to think about is whether, however, it's appropriate to get rid of all tank companies. So you might think of this in risk management terms. Yes, following the logic of this doctrinal change, you might need less tank companies, but to eliminate them is sort of not hedging your bets. It's certainly not hedging your bets. You're eliminating them. So all of that institutional memory that if you decided later you're in an operation where you do need tanks, then you've got to rebuild all that institutional memory and capacity all over again. So there's sort of a risk, there's a failure to reserve against a risk in risk management terms. And just to put some numbers on this, it's really only the tank companies that are being eliminated. So the data I have in front of me, and you can correct me if anything has changed. So the tube type artillery batteries, they're reducing from 21 to 5 batteries by 2030. The missile batteries will go up from 7 to 21 by 2030. The helicopters, those are also expensive platforms, actually more expensive than tanks. They're also going down, but they're not being eliminated. So heavy helicopter squadrons down from 8 to 5 by 2030. Medium helicopter squadrons down from 17 to 14. That's not a big cut. Light attack helicopter squadrons down from 7 to 5. A light armor is going up. We should talk about that later, from 9 to 12 companies. Amphibious vehicle companies, they're going down from 6 to 4. So nothing's being eliminated except the tanks. So is that good? Is it good to go that far?
Well, one thing I would offer is that the idea that we should not optimize for one threat, because if we have a different threat, now it's sort of a brittle solution. There's two things mitigating that. One of them is that the Marine Corps has a tremendous ally in the U.S. Army, and that the Army is not getting rid of tanks. And in fact, that's where armor will come from. So the ability to act jointly and to be interoperable with the U.S. Army, and while the U.S. Army is in many ways obviously the larger force and that kind of stuff, we'll think of them as a wonderful and handy supporting force. They'll be there to provide support to their Marine Corps brothers and sisters. The other argument, and General Berger's made this, and TX Hammes has as well, started talking publicly, is that the hope is that a force that can operate in these joint and distributed maritime operations, and that can sense at range, fire at range, understand again that kill chain, then do it again, and is also logistically very nimble. That force that can fight at the top level can fight anywhere. But a force that's optimized to fight at lower threats can't stand up to go against those sort of more pure threats. So the idea is that is a way to mitigate the risk you're talking about.
And yeah, so I follow this. I think JD wants to come in. JD.
Yeah. So as I was kind of preparing, thinking about this issue for our discussion, I thought about some permutations. So, well, what about just having tanks in the reserve, for example? The Marine Corps does that, has capabilities that are largely just in the reserve. So civil affairs companies, or there are capacities that are largely in the reserves. But those tend to be very small niche kinds of things where the skill sets can be nurtured and still, you still have some confidence in the reliability of those reservists, if you call them on. I think it'd be a much harder proposition if you didn't have any active duty tank elements, because you have no base then for where's the skills and the competency going to come from in your reserves. So then now if you're going to put most of your capability in reserves, but you still have to have some on active duty, now then you start to run up against this scope and scale question. But the other cuts you talked about as the way that the process was done for the Marine Corps, a lot of those capabilities, it's all built around the core infantry. So the infantry was also scaled back. There were, I don't know if it was 2 or 4 infantry battalions that were cut in the force design, and the infantry battalions were reduced in the base of the infantry battalions remaining. They also were reduced in size. So those other cuts with the exception of the tube artillery, like all those cuts in aviation were done on basically a proportional basis. So the ratio, you have a ratio of X amount of heavy lift and medium lift and attack helicopters that scale to the size of your infantry force. And so that's kind of I don't think it's fair to kind of look at it that way. Again, I think when it comes to tanks, there's the question of affordability. How much, if you preserve some of the force, how much then residual cost do you have you still have to have residual costs to maintain that smaller port. And I think in the issue of tanks, especially if we start to talk about the modernization part of this, which will come down the road, I just think as they looked at it that the numbers, it just didn't add up, coupled with not just within the Marine Corps force design. I think, and this is probably a good thing for us to discuss and debate, as Bill was hinting, I think there's some questions about the utility and the viability of the tank as we know it coming into future combat, given what adversary systems can do. Some of what's happened in Ukraine, for example, with fire swarms and the kinds of operations that the Russians and their proxies have been able to kind of muster against armor in those environments.
I also think that the example in Syria with Turkish forces being able to really decimate Syrian armor forces and do so with, again, Paladin, long-range fires, with combination of drones, with aviation assets. So the idea of rolling in somewhere in tanks where the tank is oriented against direct fire weapons from the front and maximum that way, and the idea that now that there's a lot of eyes in the sky right now that can drop top-down fires on you. In those examples and in wargaming, tanks may have some real survivability issues or armor on the battlefield, and that may also be part of the calculus for the Marine Corps, where they want to be survivable, distributed, and not have one of the phrases that's being used now is risk-worthy units and risk-worthy platforms.
So I follow that. I mean, I suppose we can still push back on whether, it's true, your tanks are not necessarily viable at the initial force entry stage, but then as we've seen from Iraq and Afghanistan, there was in both operations, Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, a belated realization that tanks were useful at least in the stabilization phase. So there would be a case for some redundancy there. And then, the Marine Corps may be faced with operations elsewhere than just the Pacific. So, I could still push this case that there is justification to reserve some capacity. I'm eager to hear from Rob. I'll just mention a comparative case for us to think about is Australia. Yes. So Australia is in the same region. Mm-hmm. It maintains a less than 1 battalion active component in its army, so which it could scale up if it needed to. So it's not eliminating tanks. Similar region, and it also uses M1A2s.
Yes.
So that's a comparative case we should hear about. But I'm eager to hear what Rob thinks about this.
Well, first of all, since I work for here at Fort Benning, so anything I say, all my own opinion, of course, doesn't represent the Armor School or necessarily the Armor Branch or even the U.S. Army. But I can speak a little bit, look at the historicalness of it. We really are at an interesting time talking about the viability of tanks. Of course, the U.S. Army right now is talking about mobile protected fire platforms, which historically in the past we have called light tanks. Of course, so that can still hold a different discussion. Of course, I'm supposed to use a term right now due to the doctrinal nature of how we have this vehicle being planned. But it's very interesting because we generally get into these conversations, it seems about every 20 to 30 years about the viability of tanks. Of course, there's the famous article written shortly after, I think it was the 6-Day War. I might be wrong on this, on the 6-Day War, of course, the death of the tank and how that's planned out. When ATGMs came onto the battlefield, there was this great discussion that the tank was no longer a viable platform, and yet we saw a resurgence over time. And of course, though, that's always warfare, is weapon, counter tactics. That's been very obvious that we're now in another phase of that, looking at that. But like you were saying, in Iraq, having been there myself, initially we went in very heavily armored, and then the belief was that the armor needed to be pulled out. And ironically enough, it was the Marines in Fallujah that really kind of brought about the resurgence of armor in the counterinsurgency fight, by bringing in both Marine armor and U.S. Army armor into the fight to support their infantry. And they did it quite successful. And then only a few years later, of course, you have the 3rd ACR, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Tal Afar, doing something very similar, even though they were a very predominantly armored tank Bradley focused force. So don't necessarily believe the tank, of course, is gone from the battlefield. And I've seen a lot of the material come out of Syria. It is very obvious that the battlefield threats for the tank are dramatically different than they used to be, especially with drones. But again, armor has never been designed, and when I say armor in this respect, I'm saying tanks have never been designed to fight alone. It's always been a combined arms fight. We've seen how Turkish armor units have been completely eliminated because of a lack of infantry support by Syrian TOW and RPG teams. So that fundamental has not changed at all. But as you were saying, with the Army possibly taking over the armor role from the Marine Corps, just speaking again from a historical viewpoint, the Marines traditionally were always really good at organizing their tanks as support for their Marine units. Since 1942, when they stood up their tank training center at Jacques Farm out in California, and then it got rolled up into Camp Pendleton, the whole concept was every Marine division had its own tank battalion, trained with that battalion, and then was op-conned out as necessary for amphibious deployments. And then the Korean War, we don't only see the divisional tank battalions, but we also see each regiment and regimental combat team has its own tank company. And the whole idea being is that every unit has its own armor formation to support it as it needs. What will be interesting is with the Army, if they are asked to support the Marine operations in the future, if there are some sort of amphibious operations or even just any sort of stabilization mission, it'll be interesting because really the U.S. Army right now doesn't have separate armor organizations. We still have armored battalions in name, but all of our armored formations are combined arms battalions that are designed, essentially designed to support within. So you have tank companies, infantry companies, they train together, they work together, they deploy together. We really don't have separate tank battalions that we could actually say, all right, this company will be deploying to this region during this time period. So it'll be interesting to see if the Army will actually expand upon its armor capabilities to support that mission, and if it will actually then change some of its formations and bring back a traditional tank battalion to help serve in that role.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what Rob, you made me realize there's a positive externality problem with the Marine Corps is now relying on a positive externality, which is the U.S. Army for its armor. So if the U.S. Army expands its armor capabilities, that's good for your positive externality. But if it doesn't, that's not good from the Marine Corps' perspective.
And having been in an armor brigade that actually had to give up tank companies in the past to support train rotations for Stryker units, especially when you have an organization that's designed the way it is with a combined arms battalion commanders don't like giving up tank companies if they don't have to, because that's how that unit's designed. It's not like the old days where we had combat command teams, task forces where you could take, an armored battalion, take one of its companies, piece it together, infantry battalion. It's a fairly set piece style formation that's designed specifically for its assigned missions.
Yeah,
so it'll be interesting to see how the Army handles this.
I think it's fair to say that however joint we are, we're still going to resent a extra service putting burden on our own service, right?
I think Rob made a really good point here. And I think, Rob, your point is the real risk for loss here is not the capabilities, the platform, but the fact that the Marine Corps is oriented around the infantry. I mean, there's cultural reasons, there's social reasons, but like in the Marine Corps, we actually call them there's outdoor kiddies and indoor kiddies. Mm-hmm. The Marine Corps is outdoor kiddies. Everybody else, even tanks, is an indoor kiddie. And the Marine Corps, like to Marines, it's weird to have a tank without a phone in the back.
Yes.
Because, whereas for the Army, it doesn't make as much sense, right? For the Army, armor and cavalry go together as a maneuver force. For the Marine Corps, we really think of these like small combined arms teams. And I do think that you're right. The one of the risks we face is losing that institutional capacity to really think about, plan for, develop tactics for, and to have these sort of like really, really combined infantry armor forces. And I don't know if the Army wants to do that or, sort of historically wants to do that.
And I think historically the Marine Corps has always been better, like you're saying, with that small level infantry tactics. That would have been last year. I attended a Royal Armor Corps conference, and one of the discussions was armor in cities. With Vietnam and Fallujah were heavily used, and of course a lot of Marine examples there. And one of the discussions was, how do you protect tanks in an urban environment? And my response, having had instructors and comrades that actually served in that fight, the best defense for a Marine tank in Fallujah was a Marine rifle squad, and they did it very well. The Army were really good, like you were saying, combined arms tactics, really good on the company and platoon levels, but when it gets down to individual squads and individual tanks, that's definitely always been, I think, the Marines' advantage, is that that's how they train.